Welcome to the China Memo. We make unbiased observations on structural trends. I'm your host, born in China, trained in Western finance. Half of the world's rare earth reserves sit outside China's borders. Almost none of the industrial capacity to process them does. That gap between where the ore is found and where it gets turned into something a factory can actually use. That's the story this episode is built around. We're going to treat this as a case file, a question the data doesn't fully resolve. Is China's position in rare earth a permanent choke point? Structural, durable, hard to work around? Or is it an industrial lead, built over decades, that erodes if the right capital flows to the right places? We'll lay out both sides as fairly as the evidence allows. First, a baseline. Rare earths are 17 elements. They sit together in a specific part of the periodic table, and they share certain chemical properties that make them genuinely difficult to separate from one another. In other words, think of them as 17 chemically near identical siblings. Getting one pure element out of the mix requires industrial patience, specific solvents, and in some cases, large amounts of water. They're not particularly rare in Earth's crust. The name is somewhat misleading. What's rare is finding them concentrated enough in one place to justify building a mine and a processing facility. And even when you do find them, the work of converting raw ore into a usable refined metal is where most of the difficulty, and also most of the cost, actually sits. The strategic utility is undeniable. Rare earths are the foundational components of the high-growth sectors defining the 2026 economy. EV motors, wind turbines, the guidance systems on precision munitions, high-performance electronics. Depending on the vehicle, an electric car contains somewhere between 200 and 400 grams of rare earth content, mostly in the permanent magnets that drive the motor. Now, the numbers. Global rare earth reserves, meaning deposits that are technically and economically viable to extract, total somewhere around 85 to 90 million tons. China holds roughly 44 million of those. Call it 49 to 52% of global reserves. It's not a monopoly on paper, but a commanding share. On production, meaning how much is actually mined each year, global output in 2025 came to about 390,000 tons. China produced around 270,000 of those. That's roughly 69%. The United States produced around 51,000 tons. Australia around 29,000. But here is where the numbers stop looking like a mining story and start looking like something else entirely. China processes approximately 85 to 90% of the world's rare earth. In other words, even material mined in Australia or the United States often ends up going to China to be refined. Think this way: the wheat is grown in several countries, but almost all the meals are in one. For separation specifically, the stage where individual elements are isolated from mixed ore, China holds around 91% of global capacity, by IEA estimates. For sintered rare earth permanent magnets, the end product that actually goes into an EV motor or wind turbine, China accounts for around 94% of global output. And for heavy rare earth, a subset of elements like dysprosium and terbium, which are required for high temperature applications, China controls close to 99% of global separation capacity. So the anomaly is this. The ore is distributed across many countries. The processing is not. And since the processing is where the value and the strategic leverage actually lives, China's position in mining tells you considerably less than its position in chemistry. Now, two competing interpretations of that anomaly. The first reading, permanent structural choke point. China built this position strategically over decades, using state subsidies, lower environmental compliance costs, directed investments, and a tolerance for environmental damage that the Western countries largely did not share. The processing economics are punishing. Purifying a heavy rare earth like dysprosium to 99.9% purity requires 12 to 15 separation stages. Think of each stage as a filter, and each filter requires its own facility, its own chemistry, its own waste management. A plant capable of handling 3,000 to 5,000 tons per year costs between $200 and $500 million to build. In developed markets, environmental compliance adds another 15 to 25% to operating costs. The water footprint alone is difficult to absorb outside of specific geographies. Producing 1 kilogram of yttrium, a lighter rare earth used in LEDs and lasers, reportedly requires close to 30,000 kilograms of water in processing. Under this reading, the barriers to replication are high enough that the non-Chinese supply chain will remain marginal for a long time, and China appears to know it. The second reading, transitional industrial lead. China's share of global reserves is around 50%, meaning the other half sits in Brazil, India, Australia, Russia, Vietnam, the United States, Greenland, and elsewhere. The ore is there. North America alone may hold upwards of 17 million tons in the ground, including Canada. And there are now real non-Chinese projects at meaningful scale. Lynas, the Australian company, runs an integrated mine-to-separation operation spanning Australia and Malaysia, currently processing around 22,500 tons per year. MP Materials in the United States is targeting 50,000 tons of separated rare earths per year by 2025 to 2026. Iluka, another Australian company, is planning 17,500 tons per year by 2025 to 2027. Under this reading, China's dominance reflects a first-mover advantage and an explicit industrial policy decision, not an irreversible natural fact. Given enough committed capital and time, a credible parallel chain is possible. Those two readings are not mutually exclusive, but the weight of the evidence tilts one way more than the other. Here is where the first reading holds up more firmly. Start with the investment gap. Industry estimates put the capital required to build out non-Chinese rare earth processing capacity at over $100 billion by 2035. Current committed capital sits at around $5 billion. That is not a rounding error. Even if Lynas, MP Materials, and Iluka all hit their stated targets, their combined output represents a fraction of what China currently processes, and the timeline for closing that gap runs in decades, not years. Then there's the export control record, which is now a record, not a single incident. In July 2023, China introduced the export license requirements for gallium and germanium. Both are critical for semiconductor manufacturing. Gallium goes into compound semiconductors, the kind that's used in radar, 5G infrastructure, and certain defense applications. Buyers had to apply for permits, justify end use, and name their end users. By April 2025, China's Ministry of Commerce had imposed export controls on 7 heavy rare earth elements: samarium, gadolinium, terbium, dysprosium, lutetium, scandium, and yttrium, along with related compounds and magnets. That action was explicitly framed as a response to new U.S. tariffs. In October 2025, the architecture expanded again. The revised rules extended Chinese jurisdiction to processed products and to foreign manufacturers using Chinese materials or technology, mirroring the logic of the U.S. Foreign Direct Product Rule. In other words, if a factory outside China uses Chinese rare earth refining technology to make a magnet, that magnet can now fall under Chinese export control law, regardless of where the factory is located. That is a different kind of risk from supply interruption. It's a compliance and a legal jurisdiction risk. The question stops being, can we get enough material? And it becomes, under whose legal rules do our components exist? And what happens if that jurisdiction is pulled into a new enforcement episode? A Reuters dispatch from early 2026 noted that exporters are still asking, nearly a year after the October 2025 rules, when exactly a small magnet in an everyday product becomes a controlled item. That ambiguity is not an accident. Ambiguity in licensing systems serves the licensor, and it helps to situate this in context. In 2010, China sharply reduced rare earth export quotas, triggering a price spike and a supply shock across Japan, the United States, and the EU. A WTO case followed in 2012. The panel ruled against China in 2014. The measures breached WTO rules. China dropped its formal quotas in 2015. But the structural dominance remained. Production quotas, state consolidation, and licensing took the place of the old quota system. The architecture was rebuilt, not dismantled. The current wave of controls, running from 2023 through 2026, is considerably more sophisticated than 2010. It's granular by element, targeted by country, extended to downstream products, and framed explicitly as a response to U.S. semiconductor export restrictions. Both sides are now running the same playbook in their respective areas of strength. Washington restricts advanced chips and manufacturing equipment to China. Beijing restricts rare earth inputs and processing to the U.S. and its allies. The symmetry is not coincidental. So, chokepoint or overstated risk? The honest answer is chokepoint for now, but not for the reasons most coverage emphasizes. It's not primarily about mine reserves. China holds roughly half of the global reserves, and the world holds more than enough ore outside China to theoretically supply itself. The choke point is in the midstream. Separation chemistry, magnet manufacturing, the industrial infrastructure that converts ore into something a defense contractor or an EV manufacturer can use. That's where China's position is close to monopolistic in certain categories, particularly heavy rare earth. And it took decades of state investment to build. Replicating it requires capital at a scale that is not currently flowing. The second layer of the choke point is the compliance risk. The October 2025 rule changes mean that Chinese export control jurisdiction can follow materials across borders. A company that believed it had diversified its supply chain by sourcing from a non-Chinese refiner may find that the refiner used Chinese technology or equipment, which draws the final product back under the licensing regime. The U.S. defense supply chain has been described by CSIS as entirely dependent on China for certain heavy rare earth elements and magnet types. That characterization was offered in 2025 after several years of active diversification effort and significant government attention. 4 things would move the needle on this conclusion. First, if the non-Chinese midstream capital gap closes faster than current project pipelines suggest, the $100 billion estimate is not fixed law. It assumes current permitting timelines and current levels of private capital commitment. Governments that treat rare earth processing as national security infrastructure rather than leaving it to the private sector alone can alter that equation. There are signals of that intent in the US, Australia, and parts of Europe. Whether the signals translate into committed capital is a separate question, and it hasn't happened yet at the required scale. Second, if the diplomatic channel keeps the export control escalation from becoming irreversible. In November 2025, before a Trump-Xi summit, Beijing agreed to suspend some of the newly announced controls for 1 year, covering 5 rare earth elements and certain magnet products. This seems to be more of a temporary off switch that can be switched back. That pause expires on November 27, 2026. It's a data point that both sides retain the option to negotiate rather than escalate. But a 1-year pause is not a structural shift. Third, if recycling and substitution technologies develop faster than current projections. Some applications are beginning to use less rare earth content per unit or shift to alternative magnet designs. That doesn't change the picture in the next 12 months, but it's a slow accumulating pressure on long-run demand and therefore on the severity of the choke point. Fourth, if the compliance ambiguity created by the October 2025 rules generates enough friction for Chinese exporters as well. Extraterritorial rules are not cost-free to maintain. They require documentation, enforcement, and diplomatic capital. If the costs rise, the architecture may be selectively relaxed. None of those 4 scenarios resolves the structural question quickly. The midstream is still overwhelmingly in China. The export control system is still expanding. The investment gap is still large. And the non-Chinese alternatives, while credible, are years from being substitutes. To close the case file, the anomaly stands. Roughly half of global rare earth reserves sit outside China, but around 90% of global processing does not. China's position is industrial and chemical, not geological, which matters because it's easier to point to a mine than to replicate a refinery network built over 3 decades. The 2 readings, permanent choke point versus transitional lead, are both defensible on their own terms. The first reading currently holds the stronger position, primarily because the capital required to close the processing gap isn't flowing at the necessary scale or pace. The export control architecture is not a single event. It's a system under active construction since 2023, expanding in scope and extraterritorial reach, designed with US semiconductor controls as its explicit model. And the open questions are real and worth tracking. Pace of non-Chinese midstream investment, where the diplomatic temperature settles after November 2026, and whether compliance friction in the new licensing system becomes a political cost Beijing finds inconvenient. That's where the data sits, neither clean nor catastrophic. It's complicated and still moving. Before we close, a standing note. Nothing in this episode constitutes investment advice, a recommendation to buy or sell any asset, or a view on any specific company or security. The China Memo is an analytical briefing. All figures cited are drawn from publicly available sources. This has been the China Memo. Thanks for listening.